Welcome to the How Humans Work podcast. I am truly delighted to have you on the show today.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here.
Your book, Proto, has been my most recent read, and I've found it an incredible tale. I completely love it. It's astounding, and it basically is about the progenitor language, mother tongue that led to so many languages that are alive today and languages that are no longer with us.
I mean, Indo-European is the largest language family on Earth. It's very far from the only one. There are several hundreds, depending on how you measure them. But it is the largest. It's spoken by nearly half of humanity today. There are hundreds, probably about 400 living Indo-European languages and dialects, and they include things like English, which we're speaking, Hindi, Spanish, Russian, and hundreds of others. But there are also, as you suggested, many, in fact, probably many more that are extinct by now, and they include things like Sanskrit, Latin, and ancient Greek.
The Proto-Indo-European language, what do we know about those speakers, and how do we know what we know about the people who were first speaking this language that descends?
Well, that is basically the question that I set out to answer with this book. And it turns out to be a huge and very complex question for one relatively simple reason, which is that Proto-Indo-European has been dead for thousands of years and was never written down because it was spoken before the invention of writing, at least the invention of writing in the part of the world where it was spoken. So that poses obviously a huge problem. We're talking about a language that has been dead for more than 4,000 years and was never written down. And the only reason that we sort of know that it existed is because there are these hundreds of languages, many of which are spoken today, and also the dead ones, which are very obviously related. And so linguists can study those languages, those extant languages, and work out that they all descended from a common ancestor. And by studying the similarities and the differences between those languages, which turn out to be rather regular, they can essentially reconstruct the ancestral language. And they have done that, which itself is an amazing feat. Not the entire language. They've got a reconstructed lexicon of about 1,600 words, or strictly speaking, stems of words. But that's already, amazing if you think about it, given that, these were people who spoke this language that were living 5,000 years ago in the Bronze Age, about 3,000 BC. And as I said, never wrote it down. I mean, with the very fact that we call this language Proto-Indo-European is a sort of technical term. Proto means first. So it's the first language of the Indo-European family, and we call that family Indo-European because the languages stretch from the Indian subcontinent to the west of Europe, and that already in the ancient world. Now they're spoken much further afield, so hence the name Proto-Indo-European. But obviously the people who spoke that language would have called it something different, and we'll never know what that name was because they didn't write it down and we can't ask them. So what I'm talking about and tackling in this book is a very abstract and complex problem, even though the language itself is thought to have been real and to have spoken by real people in a real time and a real place. So we would like to know, of course, who spoke it, where and when, because we are curious beings. And since we don't have any written records, at least from that time, obviously we have written records from later on in the family's evolution. I mean, for example, for Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin, right? I mean, they are dead, but we still have texts that are written in those languages. So we know for sure that they were once spoken. And all of these are grist to the mill, if you like. Those are, bits of information in the exercise of piecing together that language. But we also have other tools. One very important one is archaeology. So if you think that a language is, in a way, the reflection of the world that the people who speak it inhabit, because we speak about the things that matter to us, then you can look at that reconstructed lexicon and you can see what were the sorts of things that people were talking about, what were the sorts of environments they were describing, what were the gods they believed in, what were the technologies they knew. And now this is a difficult exercise and a controversial one, because words change meaning over time, right? So we can say, oh, look, this looks like a metal word, but does it mean the same thing as it meant now as it meant then? You know, which metal are they referring to? Is it metals generic, or is it one specific metal? There are all sorts of unknowns in that exercise. But nevertheless, being rather conservative in their extrapolations, the linguists reckon that the people who spoke this language were herders, because they speak a lot about their animals, especially horses and dogs. They were probably nomadic. They did not speak about cultivated crops, for example, very much. And they did speak about things like raiding and stealing, and the sorts of things that nomadic pastoralists quite often speak about, even today. Seasonal moving with the herds and that sort of thing. So you can start to piece together, by cross-referencing the linguistics and the archaeology, what people might have been the most likely to have spoken that language, right? Because obviously from archaeology, we get a different kind of picture. And then the third major piece of information in the puzzle is genetics. And that's what's really transformed this story over the last 10 or 20 years, which is the fact that we can now extract ancient DNA, or DNA from ancient human remains, and, in a way, follow those people through the ancient world, track their genetic trace. And so now we have information about the people themselves, that is their genes. We have information about their cultural practices from the archaeology, and we have the linguistic information about the language that they may have spoken. And by cross-referencing all of this, we can build a much more detailed picture about who those people were when they lived, and many other aspects of their lives.
What do we know now through genetics about those people in that time that we didn't say no 20, 30 years ago?
Well, if I take us back to the turn of the millennium, let's say about 2000, there were two leading theories of how the Indo-European languages dispersed and where they originated. And those two theories, there have been many more in the past, by the way, but it had sort of been whittled down to these two based on, at that time, mainly linguistics and archaeology. And those two were the steppe theory and the Anatolian theory. And the Anatolian theory placed the origin of those languages in what is now Turkey, Anatolia, the Anatolian Peninsula, at the time of the farming revolution, the invention of that package of food production techniques that we call farming. And the idea was that it happened about 9,000 years ago, and as the farmers moved out of the Middle East and Turkey, carrying their new food production methods with them, they also carried their languages, and that these were Indo-European, and that because farming allowed them could support much bigger, denser populations, these people expanded, they needed more space, they moved east into Asia, west into Europe, and they carried the languages with them. The alternative theory put the origins of the Indo-European languages in the steppe, so north of the Black Sea, the other side of the Black Sea from Turkey, in the steppe of what is now Ukraine and Russia, and put it in the mouths of, if you like, of nomads, nomadic pastoralists, because in that part of the steppe, at least in much of it, you can't grow crops. The rainfall is too unpredictable, and it's dry for large periods of the year. So those were herders who lived in those parts, and the idea is that the languages spread with them after they emerged around 5,000 years ago. So 4,000 years after the origin predicated on the Anatolian theory. So these were the two rival theories in about 2000. And what happened was that when the genetics came along, gradually, basically, the techniques were refined over time. But the kind of important culmination with respect to this story came in 2015 with two major papers that were published, which showed that there was a major turnover in the gene pool of Europe about 5,000 years ago. And that kind of demonstrated, if you like, gave a kind of concrete backbone to the theory that these people had moved out of the steppe and come into Europe. And it really bolstered the idea that, if there was such a large movement of people, as suggested by the degree of turnover in the gene pool, we're talking up to 90, even 100% in places, it would have driven huge social and cultural change, and might well have brought, a huge sweep of new languages into the region too. So it really reinforced the steppe theory at the expense of the Anatolian theory. And linguists had always been much more in favor of the steppe theory because their estimations of when Proto-Indo-European was spoken, given what they knew about the rates of evolution of language, meant that the 5,000 year date was much more likely for them than the 9,000 year date. So now, basically, to cut a very long story short, the steppe theory is really the consensus. There are some people still, holding out and adhering to the Anatolian theory, and it's important to say that the steppe theory does not explain everything, but it is the winning theory today, and it's likely to stay that way because kind of the main frame of this picture is now in place. The details will definitely change as the techniques refined, as more data come in, but the steppe theory is basically the winner.
Yeah, great. Thank you for explaining that. And if we were able to peer into that period of steppe history, and I think it's a lot around like Lake Varna and the borderlands there between, right? Is that the Black Sea, along the Black Sea
so
and the
Black
Balkan
Sea,
region?
And the reason that region is so critical in this story is because it's basically the dividing line between two very different ecosystems. The steppe, these vast grasslands or prairies, as you might say in America, that stretch across the middle of Eurasia in a huge belt, and the temperate forests, which you find, in much of Europe. So you've got this belt of steppe where, for the most part, farming is not possible. And then you've got the kind of more temperate wooded regions of Europe where farming is possible. So that is the geographical and if you like, the ecological underpinning of a major cultural boundary over time between humans who were nomadic and kept herds and humans who were settled and grew crops. And that produced a whole different mindset, and it created a tension, a border of tension. And you often see this border playing a key role in the story, whether it's conflict, whether it's competition, whether it's trade across that boundary. All the human activities that we know about throughout history and even today are playing across that boundary and across that set of tensions, and the languages are moving around it too.
Yeah. And so that border, which is interesting, and I think the word Ukraine actually means at the border, if you write about.
Yes, it does. Ukraine.
Which is amazing, and it's so current, and also the prairies and the Native American cultures who are here. I don't know if you've ever read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee.
I know of it. I have not read it.
I mean, it's a powerful story. It's another version. It's more obviously more recent, but this idea that the industrial farmers came and outcompeted hunter-gatherers, and so there's that same kind of nomadic tension even in the past couple centuries here in this continent.
I mean, that clash happens over and over again throughout history and prehistory, we're now discovering, on every continent. So, I mean, if you think about the Bible, Cain and Abel, right? The first murder, according to the Bible, is Cain, a farmer, murdering his brother Abel, who is a shepherd.
Yeah.
So, it's a recurring trope in human stories and in actual factual history as well.
Yeah. And I think there's something to learn, and I want to get more to the lessons and the learning. But if we were to peer back into that border zone, what would we see? Like, just to kind of give a little of imagination, what do we know about those people who were first speaking this unnameable language that we call Proto-Indo-European?
Okay, so there is an archaeological culture with which that language has become most associated as this body of knowledge has evolved. And that culture is known by its Russian name because it was Russian archaeologists who first named it. And it is Yamnaya, or Yamna in the Ukrainian version. because really these people were not people who recognized boundaries. They certainly didn't recognize any boundaries in the modern national sense. So, there is no division at the boundary between Ukraine and Russia, which of course is also being questioned today. So anyway, they were called the Yamnaya. And the reason they're called the Yamnaya means pit grave, and they had a very distinctive burial cult. They buried their dead in chambers that they dug. The dead person was placed on his back with his knees up very often, with a rather modest selection of grave goods, as you might expect of nomads who travel, have to carry all their wealth with them. They did not build these sort of huge, great palaces with huge, great treasuries. Everything that was valuable to them had to be mobile. And they marked their graves with these so-called kurgans, burial mounds, which still today you can see in the steppes, even though they're thousands and thousands of years old. And they're even being used, I hear, as defenses in the current war. Because they're often the only landmarks in what is a very flat landscape. So yeah, and they were used as landmarks in the ancient world as well. I mean, if you go to certain parts of the steppe, you can see them extending in long rows across the grasslands, and they were used as navigational aids in those huge prairies.
And so that must have taken some time and energy to make one of the kurgans.
Yes, very good point. There was a lot of man hours or person hours to build one, which has made archaeologists ask the question whether they were reserved for the elite or whether everyone got them. And we know, in fact, that everyone didn't get a kurgan burial because, and at least in parts of the Yamnaya range, there are many more male adult burials than burials of women and children. So obviously parts of the population were going to different graves, and graves which haven't necessarily been found. So yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, so there's so much to this story, what happened since that time and the Yamnaya people and how we are today with all the different language groups. And one of my questions is, how do you, with such a complex, complicated tale, how do you convey that in ways that people can relate with, right? Because I know there's no way to cover in a podcast every facet that you write about, and which I just want to say your writing's beautiful. It was a really terrific read. I really, really enjoyed it. So thank you for your work and effort on that.
Thank you.
But how do you convey what emerged out of that early period of the Yamnaya birthing so much?
I mean, I have to say that it starts with my own kind of marveling at what happened and my own wonder and awe at it. I mean, the thing that I suppose you need to know about the Yamnaya is that they really invented a way of life. They were revolutionaries. They may not have been aware of that, but right up until then, their ancestors had always stayed fairly close to the river valleys in which they lived, because there are these rivers that irrigate the steppe, running mainly north-south. And they mainly settled in those river valleys. They might have strayed out into the grasslands every now and then when the grass was grazed down at home, if they needed more food for their herds. But they always came back, and their villages or their settlements were inhabited all year round. The Yamnaya did something different. They went out into the grasslands, which is a very hostile environment, gets very cold in winter, very hot in summer, and there's no shade, no hiding place from, potentially hostile enemies. And they stayed there all year round, and they were mobile, and they moved cyclically with their wagons. They had wheeled technology. They had the wagons and that were drawn by oxen. And they built campsites, and then they moved on, and they knew where they were going to the extent that they always headed for places where there was enough water in the summer months and where there was not too much snow cover in the winter months so their animals could graze. And in inventing this new way of life, they essentially unlocked the huge reserves of energy in those grasslands in a way that nobody had been able to do before them. And you can see that in very concrete terms. They are their remains of these people who lived, before the beginnings, long before anything we would call medicine. They lived quite a long time. Archaeologists have found people aged 60 and over, even people aged 70 and over. From that culture, from that time. They had very strong bones and teeth. They were exceptionally tall, not only the men, but the women too. Not everybody, of course, but that was the tendency. And they, once they had emerged on the steppe, they underwent quite a rapid population explosion, which meant that they needed more space. So, in an echo of that story that I told you about the farmers in Turkey, which definitely happened, even if it wasn't them that carried the Indo-European languages far and wide, they needed more space. And these were nomads, so I guess they needed more space, or a different kind of space anyway than farmers. They needed grazing pastures, and they needed, they just needed more space in order to graze their much larger herds on. So they moved out, and they moved out both east towards Asia and west towards Europe, and carried the Indo-European languages with them. So that is the kind of big bang, if you like, that happens at the beginning of this story. The Yamnaya are only the first chapter in a way, and according to some, not even the first, because it's then their descendants who carry the languages further afield. They probably get as far as Hungary, which is the edge of the Carpathian Basin, which is the edge of the steppe where it gives way to the temperate forests of Europe. They probably didn't go further. These were steppe specialists. They were not adapted to forest realms. But their descendants, looks like they may have interbred with the farmers of the neighboring forests. And their descendants, who, inherited skills from both sets of people, then moved into those forests and carried descendant languages further. So you're looking at a story that took place over many generations, many different but related cultures, but the ultimate result is that the Indo-European languages are spoken the length and breadth of Eurasia. Even before we get to, the time of Christopher Columbus, they're widely spoken. And then after Christopher Columbus and the imperial period, they spread even further to all continents of the world.
It's just remarkable. It's remarkable to consider that move out of those river basin valleys into the grasslands, and the physical changes that came along with it. And I kind of imagine, I don't know if I'm understanding this right, but suddenly there was these taller people, and I would have thought that the farming would have produced more population, but it's really interesting to think of the steppes and the nomadic lifestyle as producing more population pressures. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the story on farming has changed quite a lot over recent decades. I mean, the thing about farming is that it does it supports more people for a given piece of territory. But because you've got people staying in one place, staying in settled communities, living more densely, certainly the early farming communities were very vulnerable to infectious disease. To the cause of any kind of cause of a population crash, really, because they didn't have that ability to move and to spread out. And so after the invention of farming, there are these bursts, but overall, and there are these radiations of people as they move out looking for more land, but the overall population doesn't really grow. So life was pretty grim, it's now thought, for those early farmers. Certainly until they'd become more, their immune systems had become better adapted to those diseases for a start. And, there may have been a sort of transitory intermediary period where the nomads were, doing better, certainly in terms of health. And that might be what we're looking at here. It certainly might be part of the explanation because there is another major mystery in this story, which is how the incoming nomads, if we focus on Europe for a second, the estimates suggest that by the time the nomads came into Europe, Europe was thoroughly settled by the farmers from the earlier wave of immigration. The number of farmers settled there is estimated to be about 7 million. And if you think that at the height of the migration of the nomads from the steppe, there wouldn't have been more than several tens of thousands of them. So how did these several tens of thousands of incoming nomads managed to impose their languages on 7 million settled farmers speaking completely unrelated languages, that has been a head scratcher of a problem
Huh.
for archaeologists and scientists more broadly, ever since we first detected, or the geneticists first detected, that major turnover in the gene pool 10 or more years ago. And we could,
Clue as to what could be what could have that?
yeah, the obvious next question: what's the explanation? So I go into this in quite a lot of depth in Proto, but I mean, if you had asked that question about 10 years ago, probably most people would have answered violence. That the main reason for that turnover in the gene pool is that the incoming nomads were violent, and they raped and pillaged and murdered their way across the continent, even causing what we might refer to as a genocide in modern terms. But that is no longer the explanation at all. Not to say that there wasn't violence in places. In fact, we're pretty sure there was in some parts of Europe, but it probably isn't the main reason that the Indo-European languages spread in Europe. In fact, the explanation is now thought to be more multifactorial, like different strands to it. And actually, just in the last year or so, even since the publication of my book, one of the theories that I put forward in my book has begun to look a lot stronger, which is that there may have been quite dangerous epidemics of infectious disease raging at that time, including a form of plague. That those nomads might even have brought in with them, since they were people who lived so closely with their herds. And plague, amongst some of the other diseases that were raging at that time, are what's called zoonotic diseases, meaning they are originally animal diseases that jump the species barrier and become human diseases. So it could have been them. We can't say definitively, but it could have been the nomads who brought plagues in, plagues plural, dangerous epidemic diseases, which then decimated the populations of farmers, precisely because they were more vulnerable to those diseases, which they may not have been exposed to before, whereas the nomads may have been through the sort of tempering rounds of exposure, and their immune systems may have adapted somewhat. And that could explain, to a large extent, why these numerically inferior nomads managed to impose their languages. Again, there are other explanations, but I think that one is very front and center in people's minds at the moment, because there is gathering evidence that there were epidemics at the time.
Yeah. And you know something about epidemics. You wrote a book about an epidemic.
I did, yes, well
Yeah.
remembered, well remembered.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's fascinating because just a few years ago, nobody had any idea that plague was even a disease before the Middle Ages, or before the early Middle Ages, before the plagues at the end of the fall of the Western, Roman Empire. That raged in Europe at that time. But now we know that in the Bronze Age, thousands of years earlier, it was already a problem. It may not have been exactly the same disease, because the pathogen is also evolving, like the humans. But it could have been quite lethal still.
It's both like reassuring and unsettling that the same problems that we have in our time were existing for
Isn't it?
1,000 years ago.
Yeah.
There's something really interesting about it. This conversation, I think, around migrations, gene replacement, change of people, change of cultures, tensions between cultures. And I just find that super helpful in some way. I don't know if that makes sense, but just
Yeah,
to know
totally.
that,
And I mean, this genetics revolution that I was referring to has really transformed our understanding of prehistory in just the ways you're talking about. Because, until, let's say, 20 years ago, archaeologists were still discussing now, did these major social and cultural changes, the farming revolution, or the advent of the Indo-European languages, did these things come with people or separately from people? In other words, did people migrate into Europe or east into Asia, carrying these ideas and languages with them, or did the languages and the ideas just diffuse through, relatively static populations? Nobody could answer that question 20 years ago. And now genetics means that we can answer that question. We can see the people moving, and we know, for the first time, that migration has been a major force that has shaped humanity, not only populations, in their fiber, if you like, in their biology, but also cultures, languages, thinking, religion, politics since, it's for a very long time, much longer than we could ever prove just a short time
Yeah.
ago.
And in a time of globalism where it's more front and center, and I just recently did a show around uncontacted tribes and their vulnerabilities, their genetic and survival vulnerabilities with the organization called Survival International, which you may know.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, yeah, amazing issues. But this idea of migration, globalism, interaction, different tensions, and so I'm partly with the story that this was violence and kind of assuming that violence was the norm of those ages, and it really necessarily wasn't. It was, I'm sure there was tension. So what can we say about the collaboration and the tensions of those early nomadic farmer dynamics that maybe don't, maybe that's too deep a question for
Well,
your
I mean, let me see if I can take a little sideways approach to that question. So, another of the things that the geneticists and the archaeologists have realized through their kind of cross dialogue in the last 10 or so years is that the turnover in the gene pool that I keep talking about, that happened about 5,000 years ago, it may not have been as sudden as all that. It could have happened over, let's say, 6 or 10 generations. And if you allow even, a generation, let's say it lasts about 25 years, it's certainly at that time. So we're talking, max 250 years. It's nothing in the scheme of the huge span of time that I'm talking about in this book. But nevertheless, it's quite a long time. And if you talk about a turnover in, a couple of centuries like that, you may get the signature of something that looks very abrupt and violent, but in fact isn't. You've got, perhaps people coming into the area, let's say, settling. Perhaps they have, no commerce, let's say, in the widest sense of the word, with the farming neighbors who are settled nearby for a long time, but they don't fight them either. Maybe they start trading because each brings different skills, different types of knowledge. So perhaps they start, trading the objects that they're each good at making or knowledge about food production. And then eventually, and we know this from history that this is often the pattern, eventually, but not immediately, they start interbreeding, marrying, interbreeding, having mixed children. And then those children speak both kinds of languages. They know both kinds of food production techniques. They combine, the most useful of each in one generation, in terms of what's best adapted to the environment in which they live. And that's the way, that genes might come in, that languages might come in without any violence. So you can think about in some ways, the genetic picture can be misleading if you don't understand the underlying mechanisms that can give rise to that picture. And there may be many different underlying mechanisms. We've already discussed a few, pandemics, violence, this kind of slower intermingling and eventual interbreeding that would give rise to the same eventual signature, i.e. the same picture of turnover in the gene pool. And you have to sort those out. And sometimes you can't sort them out, but you have to at least allow that all of them might have, been part of the picture.
Yeah. No, that's great. I appreciate that. And I think that there's something helpful about dispelling incomplete or false conceptions of what prehistory was and what our origins is that I think is really important to today's social conversation. So I want to ask you, what else do you love about this story or this tale that you invested so much of your life in? Like, in addition to appreciation for the revolution of the Yamnaya people and what their choices begot into the world, what else?
I mean, one of the things that's very difficult to discern before the beginning of history, before the beginning of written records, the invention of writing, that is, about 5,000 years ago, is people's motivations, why people did things. You can't ask them and they haven't written it down. So you can only, take the wildest guesses about why they were behaving the way they do. But what seems clear, even if only from the reconstruction of their language, is that they were people who believed very much in the supernatural. They worshipped, a range of gods. they explained things that happened to them and that happened in the world in terms of supernatural forces and, gods and sacrifices made or not made and so on. That was the world they inhabited. Don't forget, we're talking about the Bronze Age here. And so you can already see that in, for example, some of the names that have been reconstructed. So, the supreme deity for the Romans was, of course, Jupiter, as we would say it, or Jupiter, as the Romans themselves might have said it, and that is related to the name of the supreme god in the ancient Indian pantheon, Dyaupita, and also related linguistically and culturally to the supreme god for the ancient Greeks, who was Zeus Pater, Zeus to us. And all of them mean or are derived from names that mean Father Sky, Sky Father, the head of the sky, the top god of the sky. They evolve in different ways, both mythologically and linguistically, so they may not retain the same, attributes or stories as they diverge in the different cultures, but that they come from the same ancestor seems fairly clear. Linguists are fairly sure of that. And so you can get these little peeks from the language, from the archaeology, into what their worldview was, into how they conceived of things, and in a very crude way, no better, because again we don't have written records, we can start to glimpse their motivations and what made them behave in the way they did, and I think that's one of the things that I find so fascinating. So there's one chapter, I think it's chapter 4, where I talk about the Tocharian branch of the family. And many people listening to this may never have heard of Tocharian, but it's one of the early branches that came off the sort of Proto-Indo-European tree, if you like. And to distill a lot of research into a few sentences, basically the consensus is that this was an early group of Yamnaya who split off from the main population and headed east. We don't know why, but it looks like they trekked across the entire length, pretty much, of, well, at least half of the steppe of Eurasia. It's thousands and thousands of miles to reach the Altai Mountains, where their descendants set up home. And we know that because a descendant of their language was still being spoken in that region of the world, in the Silk Roads, along the Silk Roads around the Tarim Basin, in the region of Eastern Central Asia, just west of the Gobi Desert, north of Tibet, which we can trace back to that language. Now, the fascinating thing about the Tocharian speakers is that it looks like their migration across Central Asia happened quite rapidly. Some people say a couple of generations, maybe 50, 100 years. The most radical view is that it happened in 2 years. So it was one bold set of pioneers that headed out. And now, why would they do that? And why would they go so far? Obviously, we can't ask them. But if you were to say that climate change was a factor in the mix, it probably wouldn't have pushed them that far, because the climate varies a lot across the steppes. So they wouldn't have had to go so far to get away from whatever drought or whatever it was they were escaping. So again, to cut a long story short, the idea is that probably there was some propulsive force pushing them away, and the idea is that they may have been led by a prophet, a very charismatic prophet, who said, we're going to go, we don't believe in this old religion, or this old religion has become degraded and depraved, we want to go and start again and build a new society, a utopia, and we're going to go over there to those beautiful mountains, the Altai, and the other end of Central Asia. And he was charismatic, so he could persuade them to follow him and to, take their lives in their hands, really, because it would have been a very dangerous journey to cross the steppe at that time. And so that's what I mean. You see, you can't ask them, you don't know what their motives were, and yet you can glean some very, faint clues about what was going on in their heads.
What time period was that migration?
That would have been soon after the beginning, so we're still talking in the 5,000 year ago range.
And then the Tocharian language was spoken up through the Silk Road era, right?
And then we know the first records of Tocharian are basically from the Middle Ages, what we call in Europe anyway, the Middle Ages, 1,000 years old now, roughly, from the Tarim Basin and the Silk Roads. Yeah, that area.
Wow. Yeah, that's kind of amazing. So that's a long stretch. Obviously, that language evolved. It had the same kind of rules of change. So what was originally spoken. Hmm. And then
Yeah.
was that the language that was spoken up until like a couple centuries ago? There was some remnants of it, or was that a different language that would lasted
No,
deep into the future?
Tocharian has been quite a long time
Hmm.
extinct.
Was
But what might you be thinking of? I mean, the Anatolian languages, because one branch of the Indo-European languages were spoken in Anatolia, even that if that
Yeah.
wasn't their origin, they were being spoken not long before the supposed birth of Christ. Um, uh, well, some of them were. Some of them may have survived even into the first millennium of the Common Era. So they aren't still spoken. They were replaced on the Turkish peninsula by the Turkic
Yeah.
languages that themselves came west from the Altai region. Um,
Yeah.
so
So
the story
the
gets
movements,
more
the complexity
complicated.
of movements of
Yeah,
peoples and language. I mean, it's really,
exactly.
really complex. I was like,
As more time goes on, the more complex it gets.
yeah. And so what does that complexity teach you? Like, what did you, by looking at all the complexity of like, oh, it wasn't just from east to west, it is from west to east. It's overlapping layers, it's genetic replacement, it's cultural. The god, the sky father is kind of a pattern that's there. What did that teach you about that period of history, say, between then and now? What's
I
that give
mean,
you?
uh, like at the most basic level, we are all the products of migration. Everything we are, whether it's genetics, culture, the languages, we are layers and layers and layers and layers built on top of each other of different mixes of people. So, that's the broad message really, is that there's no such thing as a pure language. There's no such thing as a pure culture. And those that survive today, whether you're talking about genes or culture or language, are the ones that remain light on their feet, if you like, remain adaptable. So, I think, if we concentrate on language for a moment, people have a tendency to think that the languages that we speak, and as I said, many of them in the world today are Indo-European. Most people do speak an Indo-European language, or at least nearly half of humanity. We have a tendency to feel about our language that there's something sort of static and fixed about them, that they've always been and that they were destined to be. Nothing could be further from the truth. They have always evolved. It's a matter of it's a great proportion of that. The reason why we speak those languages is down to historical accident, and a kind of melange of climate change and pandemics and migration and trade and technology and all these things.
War,
Which war, of course, yeah,
horses, chariots.
absolutely, absolutely, all of those in the
Hmm.
mix.
Hmm.
Different food production techniques that resulted in these languages expanding, and at least some of them hanging in there. So we still speak them today.
Yeah,
But you have to remember that even in the
yeah.
Indo-European language family, many have gone extinct. So it's not like there's something intrinsically successful about Indo-European. Um, a large reason for their success is that initial big bang, which carried them so far and wide and gave them like a fighting start, if you like.
So my intrigue in how I found your book is I started getting interested in the Silk Road. I started thinking, the American and maybe much of the West and Europe, that the imagination of the world kind of has a certain boundary in the Middle East. And I started thinking about the relationship with the Silk Road, and then I started to realize, wow, the steppe was so influential in terms of like how we became what we became in terms of both Europe and the whole world. And the way I understand it is the Silk Road periods was a time of obviously many things, but among them was trade. And that trade wasn't just silk. It actually, before then, there was, you may have heard this thing called the Jade Road. And they used to trade jade really like, it was pretty fundamental, probably like some of the stones you talk about in the Bronze Age. And, and, and my hope is, and there's partly two things I have going on with my interest in looking at history. One is I've started to move out of this kind of Californian ahistorical spiritual view of the world and really look at the fiber, look at the actual nitty-gritty of the historical trends. And I think the spirituality and the stories of the Silk Road are really, really fascinating way to kind of break through nativism, nationalism, limited perspectives about the human story. So I that was my kind of starting point of getting really interested in finding your book of Proto. And what I found when I got to Proto is like, oh my gosh, the Silk Road is so recent in terms of like
Yeah,
trade
exactly.
and motion and migrations. I'm like, God, the Silk Road isn't even that
I mean,
old in a certain
by the
way.
way, Jeff, you
Mm,
know, the bronze roads. So when the Bronze Age was at its height, the roads that they built for trading bronze far and wide were
yeah.
transporting vastly bigger volumes of that commodity than the Silk Roads later did.
Isn't that
So we,
amazing?
you know, if you look at the broad sweep of human history, including prehistory, I think we've gone through these periods of globalization, and then, you know, collapse and then growing globalization again. But what globalization, which is, you know, you can think of as sort of, you know, extreme migration in a way, it you know, there are good and bad things in a way moving along those routes. I mean, it's the conduit for whatever your favorite commodity is, silk, bronze, but it's also the conduit for pathogens, you know, the Black Death that traveled through these trade routes, and also, of course, for technology and languages and religious ideas. And so, you know, they are amazingly powerful sculptors of human populations and culture through these different things that they channel around the world, if you like.
I want to pay a particular attention to the horse story and the human relationship with the horse a little bit. Would you be
Mm.
willing to share a little bit about how not just the Sky Father story was across the Eurasian reaches, but actually the relationship with the horse?
Yeah. So, you know, one of the big questions still, I think, really, about that big bang of Indo-European languages and the Yamnaya, who we think probably spoke them or were the first speakers of them, is how come that radiation happens so fast, right?
Uh-huh.
And one of the theories has been that because the Yamnaya rode, essentially, they were able to cover much larger distances. And so that has raised the question of, I mean, that is incredibly controversial. I should start by saying that. And the reason it's controversial is because it's very difficult to pinpoint in the archaeological or the genetic record, for that matter, the point where horses were sufficiently domesticated to allow horse riding. Um, and the reason that's difficult is because domestication is not an event; it's a process. And it's a process which probably happened over thousands of years, in the sense that you may first herd wild horses. You may then, you know, you corral them. You perhaps start, you know, riding them bareback. You get them tame enough to milk. We know that the Yamnaya already drank fermented mare's milk, and a mare has to be fairly tame for you to be able to milk her. Otherwise, she's going to kick you in the head, and you know you're not going to get any milk out of her. So milking suggests quite a high degree of domestication. But at what point, you know, horses were tame enough, domesticated enough to carry their riders into raids, to not be skittish in a raid, uh, that sort of thing is difficult to determine. There are people, David Anthony, one of the leading Indo-European scholars and anthropologist in your country, he thinks that the Yamnaya did ride horses, and that they because they rode horses, his theory is that because they rode horses, they were able to corral much larger herds. That meant of not just horses, of cows and goats and sheep. And that in turn meant that they had more animals in their herds than they needed for to meet their basic requirements in terms of food and textiles and manure for heating. And that meant that they could exchange animals in tribute. And through a system of tributes, a sort of hierarchy of clan chiefs, where you pay tribute to the superior, to the more dominant one, and he offers to protect you. Through this system, you could build very large networks of alliances, and that enabled you to increase your sway, increase your influence, and the networks through which your languages might spread. So he thinks that the Yamnaya did ride, that this meant that they could command bigger herds, that they could move further and faster, send scouts out to, look for promising seams of metal in the east and the west. And
Would that
that's,
also explain some of the speed of the Tocharian migration, perhaps?
it could do. It could do, yes. Again, difficult to know for sure what role horses played in that migration. I think the sort of prevalent idea is more that there may have been people on horseback who were sort of outriders looking out for, hostile tribes, or acting as scouts, telling people where to go. But the majority of people were not on horseback at that point in the story. They would have been walking across the steppe beside the wagons which carried first of all, they're old and they're sick and they're pregnant and they're small babies, but also their goods, their equipment, their, living what they needed to live. But there are people who disagree with David Anthony as to whether the Yamnaya rode. One of the key people is Natalia Shishlina, the Russian archaeologist who I visited in the southern Russian steppe in the summer of 2023. I wrote about it in the book. And she's one of the leading experts on the Yamnaya, and she doesn't think they rode. She thinks that some of the signs that have been found on their skeletons, which others have interpreted as evidence of horse riding, could actually have been caused by walking long distances, carrying heavy loads, engaging in other sorts of manual activity, repetitive manual activity. So there is a debate there, and it's not resolved yet. May never be resolved.
Yeah.
But it's a fascinating question.
Did all the horses come from that group of horses? Was that the steppe horses were the ones that all
Yeah,
modern horses are genetically connected to?
so it isn't just human DNA that, we can now look at from the ancient world. There's also animal DNA and indeed, microbial DNA, which is why, geneticists are beginning to learn so much about the diseases that plagued humans at that time. But the horse DNA from the ancient world suggests that there was but this comes after the Yamnaya. This is more like around 2000 BC, around the same time as the invention of the chariot, a much speedier vehicle than the old lumbering wagon. And these things happen about 2000 BC, so 4,000 years ago. By then, the Yamnaya have already disappeared from the archaeological record, and there are, descendant cultures who continue the process of domesticating the horse and invent the chariot. And at that point, 2000 BC roughly, you see a big change in the horse gene pool in the world. And essentially these horses which are being domesticated on the western side of the Urals spill out and go on gradually to replace most of the wild horses in the world. And all the horses that we know today are descended from those first domesticated horses which spilled out then. It's an amazing story, isn't it? That story has also changed a lot in the last few years, because previously it was not thought to be the Yamnaya. In fact, there's still some debate. It isn't resolved. But other people to the east of the Urals who also raised horses known as the Botai were thought to have been responsible for that major change in the horse gene pool. So now the story is looking a bit more complicated.
Yeah, it's very complicated. But the horses became in the chariots, and then there was this amazing kind of rituals you spoke of, burials where horses, and one of the powerful, I think it was the Sintasha culture, if
Mm.
I remember, where they did the burial, and the burial was of a great warrior as if he was on his last chariot ride laid
Yeah,
out. Is that the one?
yeah, yeah. So
Mm,
their chariots and horse riding were very central to their culture, and you can see that in their burial rites.
yeah.
As you mentioned, great warriors who are buried with their horses and with all their finery, as if engaged in the last fight or the last chariot ride. Yeah.
Yeah. So the culture has changed by then. By the time the chariots come around and the horses come around, there's a lot more
Yeah, and
speed
and
and a
and
lot
of
more
course,
change, right?
right? We're talking about 1,000 years on. A lot changes. Everything changes, in fact. So you'd be surprised if things had stood still over that time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that looking at the horses because I do have this interest in ritual and in the human story and our the side of our roots that is more mythical, is more religious as in terms of experience and is more connected to the living world or the living earth in some ways. So when you would write about that in a book, it was so intriguing to know like the burial rites and the relationship with the horses and it's a very fascinating aspect of the tale. But I
Yeah,
do
and
want
it's
to, yeah, go ahead.
key. Sorry, I was just going to say that, to people who inhabited the steppe, life would have been pretty impossible without the horse. First as a source of food, later as a source of transport. And so that, in a way, explains why the horse was so central to their language and to their belief system. And you can see that in the traces of Proto-Indo-European and in the various myths that have been reconstructed through bilinguists from the descendant languages and mythical systems too.
I want to get more into the contemporary implications here. And one of the things that your book gave me is an appreciation for not just the enormity of the historical flows of migrations of people and languages, but the natural tensions that are there that we started to speak about, say, between the nomadic herders and the pastoralists and the farmers. And then some of the, like the genetic changes and the tensions that are there. And I realized that there's a kind of what I would say is there's I think a deep fear in the human story around change. I know people feel it in their personal lives of like, oh, I'm changing, I'm aging, I'm getting older, I have to face my mortality. It's like a very personal thing. And then it also happens with people, their attachment to their language and their cultures. And so there's this way in which it's nativism, nationalism, kind of some support identities that kind of make us feel there's a constancy to our story. And there's a kind of a protective desire, I think, that somehow relieves some fear around the true massive change that this planet is and that life is and the unfolding story that it is. So I feel like that the proto story is kind of medicine and gives me both compassion for that aspect of like, wow, yeah, it is really scary. The world does change a lot. Everything does migrate more. Everything that's familiar to us is going to continue to change in some way. What are
Yeah.
your thoughts on that? Do you have reflective thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, look, as I said, what we've learned over the last 10, 20 years is that migration has been a sort of staple of the human story. Um, and migration means change. And languages die and are born. And today, many more are dying, it seems, than are being born. So, yes, there is something about that that isn't inherently scary. And it's reasonable to be scared in a sense because our language is so tangled up with our sense of identity, and not just our language, perhaps in different ways our culture, and of course our genes. But um I think the point is that it's a little bit as we were talking about when we were discussing the Silk Roads, is that this traffic, this migration, this interaction brings what from the recipient might be perceived as both good and bad things, right? So the Silk Roads bring trade but also disease.
Hmm.
The Bronze Roads bring exciting new technologies that promise great wealth, but also potentially violent new incomers or people whose languages are going to replace your own, and so on. And the particular context, the particular case that you're talking about, the outcome of that meeting, of that interaction, will be different every time. And at the moment, at least, is fairly unpredictable. Even when we're looking at the past, the way that, say, a language changed in a particular region may not be the same at one time as it was in another, depending on who was meeting, how their numbers compared, how they thought, whether they met in violence or peace or whatever. So, I'm trying to avoid making any value judgments, but the fact is that if you look back over the grand sweep of the past, there has always been migration, there has always been change, and the languages, since mine is a book about language, I'll focus on language. The languages that have not kept up with this changing context have died. It's the ones that have adapted and evolved that have survived the longest.
And in an era of globalism and English becoming the lingua franca for a lot of things, soccer included, football, what can we know about what we're dealing with today in terms of our language and the rate of technology? I mean, I have daughters who are, I think they're Gen Z, and that kind of like the way they text and what they're expressing. I'm like, wow, this is really moving at a speed. And so both honoring change and maybe also the need for people to want to slow it down, or want to keep some constancy, or work with the rate, or kind of break change a little bit. Yeah. Kind of a counterflow to.
I mean, yeah, as I say, I can understand the sentiment. My own feeling is that change is life, change is. Now, if things stop changing, that tends to be bad, because it means whatever it is not adapting. But the outcome of the interaction is not beyond our agency. We can steer it to some extent. I mean, so the example I often give is language in the United States. Okay. The migration into the United States shifted past a tipping point in the 1970s where it stopped being predominantly European and it became predominantly Latin American. And that had obviously linguistic consequences because the main language spoken by those immigrants from Latin America was Spanish. Okay. So now, the immigrants coming into the United States from the 1970s on are overwhelmingly Spanish speaking. Now, in the last few years, with your current, and previous administrations, there's been a tendency to reinforce English over other languages as the national language, to make it the only language of administration, right? And so you've got these two opposing forces meeting at the moment in the United States. The one that is reinforcing English as the main national language, and the sort of deeper force, if you like, of the force of immigration, the demographic force, which is bringing more and more Spanish speakers into the space. Now, which will eventually, win out is going to be the result of many different, historical and political and demographic factors. But political things are things that we, can potentially control through the democratic process. So it's not as if we don't have a say in these things. It's just that they are rather unpredictable, the outcome.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing about Proto is it at least for a good portion of our us speaking the Proto-Indo-European language family, we're more deeply connected than we realize. So it's like on the surface, it's
Exactly.
like Spanish, English, but the real teaching here is like, hey, we all come from this deep mix of migrations, be it the Silk Road, the Bronze Road, the Jade Road, and that if we can open our minds and open ourselves to that layer of history, then I think we're a lot closer than we might have realized by any particular
Absolutely.
upbringing we each have.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that was probably how I would want to end the conversation, is that, the resemblances the resemblances are there even though we don't always see them. And they're deep.